Hi, everyone. Welcome to week four's lecture on grief and memoir. My name is Victoria Katainen. Some of you may know me from previous subjects such as EL 3050, post-colonial narratives, or BA 1002, our space, place making, and networks, or you may know me from Lit Print and Society and various other things that I have taught. What you might not know about me is that I am also an emerging creative writer. I've been sort of dabbling in this space for much of my life, but begun to take it much more seriously after the death of my mother. And I will explain a little bit about that today. So thank you very much for joining us for this lecture. I intend for it to be, as Emma gives it, in 4 parts. Thank you for your patience as it's delivered a little bit later than I had planned because I've been a bit unwell. I hope the acoustics are okay today and that you can follow along. So I just wanted to acknowledge country. First of all, I'm joining you from Bindle Country, a land that is presided over by shooting stars and a land that I spend every day walking upon, and it gives me great solace. And I also live and play in Wilgaruga country, the country of the canoe. And here are some pictures of Magnetic Island where I enjoy family holidays and other walks as well. So I wanted to do that straight away, partly because today's lecture is also going to be touching on issues to do with country in various ways. So I've called this lecture today Coming to Terms. It's largely going to be about grief and memoir, but it will touch on a few other things as well, such as trauma. So I want to begin today's lecture by also giving you a content warning. Because we're talking about memoir, sometimes things can be quite personal and we have to make decisions about what we share and don't share. But at this point in my life, I've decided to be quite open about a number of issues that come up in the memoir that I'm writing. And so today I just wanted to give you a trigger warning that there will be references to rape. There will also be references to cancer and to death and to displacement. So I have a cup of tea today while I'm giving this lecture. It's licorice tea. It's quite comforting. But I just wanted to encourage you to be gentle on yourself. While we're writing about and reading about grief, that's something that we all have to do. So I first became interested in grief narratives when I found myself writing one 3 years after I lost my mother to pancreatic cancer. Her terminal illness ran a jagged course alongside my own academic career while I was raising 3 little kids who were my mother's only grandchildren and who lived across the sea from her. I had come to Australia for what I thought would be a brief adventure, a 3.5-year course of studying a PhD at the University of Queensland. And I had chosen to go to the University of Queensland in Australia, not only because it seemed like a grand adventure, to be able to undertake a wonderful opportunity where I had been given a scholarship both by the Government of Canada and an international scholarship by the University of Queensland and the Government of Queensland that allowed me to take myself and my partner and our then 4-year-old son Magnus on an adventure to Australia to finish a PhD I'd already commenced actually in northern Canada. Now, as I said, I thought that was just going to be for about 3.5 years, and I went to Brisbane because Brisbane had been the birthplace of post-colonial theory, and it had a group called the Post-Colonial Research Group, and it had written a book called The Empire Writes Back, and that had been a very, very important book to me that I discovered while I was doing my master's, and because of that I wanted to study with these people and think about comparative issues to do with colonization, colonialism, displacement, and migration as they had affected settler colonies like Canada, where I grew up, or Australia, where I moved, and even the United States of America. So that's my big, long preamble. Now, the reason why I give you this slide is because Google Maps gives me a number for the distance that fell between my mother and me when I moved across the sea to have this grand adventure. It tells me now that James Cook University, where I work and where I accepted my first tenure-track job after my PhD at UQ, is 11,640 kilometers across the Pacific from the beach I used to play at as a child. But this distance was something I could not easily account for or reconcile in numbers. I watched the sun sink across the ocean from the 5th floor of a high-rise when my mother died. And I wondered then if the hospital administrators for the hospice on the top floor of the hospital had put it there for the view. I had missed, since I had lived in Australia, the sun setting on the Pacific, because, of course, where I live and work now, the sun rises on that same sea. So I hope you'll bear with me as I circle back to some of these personal issues, as I find my way through something of an unorthodox, sort of autoethnographic and personal approach to a lecture, one that is about various kinds of disorientation, not only geographic, but also personal and academic. So as I intimated before, my work is partly about loss of country and loss of loved ones, but it's also about a loss of professional orientation. This is the landscape I grew up with. The woods there are dark and deep and very different from the woods that I walk in now on Bindle country. And the working title of my manuscript in progress is Bewilderment, partly because it's very much about the disorientations that can happen to us in the aftermath of grief. It's a memoir about migration, mental health, and mourning. By and large, I am not going to address the contents of that manuscript in this particular talk. Instead, I'm going to talk about the kinds of disorientation I went through in relation to my academic training that had taught me to approach texts in a particular way as a literary scholar. And the way that going through this process actually caused me to have a deep rethink about that and begin approaching what I do differently. I love etymology, as some of you who may have studied with me before know. I'm constantly looking at the origins of words, and the etymological history of the word bewilderment is that it is a word that first appears in writing in the 1780s, derived from the word bewilder or bewilder, that meant in the 1600s to perplex or puzzle or confuse, to be thoroughly wilder. It meant to be led astray or to be lured into the wilds. And it was related to the word wilderness, which came into the English language in the 1500s and meant an uncultivated or desolate region or state. My manuscript is partly about being part of the lost generation, not the literary lost generation. Those of us who do literary studies generally associate with F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and the expatriate experience after the First World War. Although I have spent quite a bit of my scholarly career thinking about that period. And it is a fascinating period, not only because the 1920s and 30s so often, in so many ways, mirrored the first decades of our 21st century, where we went through a boom in an economy with new kinds of communication technologies proliferating, and then a bust after that, like the 20s and the 30s. It's also a period that fascinates me, though, because in the aftermath of what they called the Great War, because it was before they knew there would be a Second World War, so they didn't call it the First World War at the time. In the aftermath of the Great War, we began to encounter mass traumatization. Now, the word trauma doesn't enter the English language in the way that we use it now until actually far more recent than many of us realize. But the soldiers who returned from the trenches in World War I were often classified as suffering from something called trench warfare or combat stress, I think, is even a more modern way to talk about it. There are various different terms people were beginning to use at that time to grapple with some form of mass traumatization that these soldiers had clearly been exposed to in the trenches. And the writing of that period also deals with that. I'm interested in that as well. But the lost generation I write about in my own memoir is not about them. That's not about that, not particularly anyways. It's a term given to us by a researcher called Simon Baron-Cohen. He's actually the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, the famous actor. And he is a very prominent researcher, if not the world's most preeminent researcher, of what we in Australia call ASD, or the autistic spectrum disorder, or which they still call in England Asperger's. And he uses the term the lost generation to describe those people born and raised before the autism spectrum came into diagnostic manuals and common understanding. Many of whom, he says, are still living impossibly challenging lives without diagnosis and support. Many of whom are fully fledged adults and never received any kind of support for being on the spectrum, many of whom never found work or were particularly very gifted in certain kinds of work, many of whom are now aged or dying. And this story of being lost is my family story. And it's part of what compounded my grief in the loss of my mother being a really important figure who kind of held a very complex family together. So I'm not going to be talking about that in this. Of course, there's ethical issues around writing about family, and I navigate and have been navigating those really complex issues in my own memoir, partly by making sure that this is a story about me and not primarily about my relatives on the spectrum. But I just wanted to raise that I'm not talking about those issues in this lecture. I'm talking about grief, and I'm talking about the way in which my grief was particularly complex because of my displacement from my family, from my home, because of a career choice I had made that had led me across the sea, and because of some difficult and complex family dynamics that had gone unaddressed for many, many, many years in my family's